Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast. I'm John, and today I'm going to be having a quick look through the second of two combined rules tomes that I've received an advanced pre-released PDF copy of from the Old School Essentials Advanced Fantasy Kickstarter. And today I'm going to be looking at the Referees Tome, which has a pimp-ass lich on the front cover. Okay, so I did an episode recently where I looked through the other of the combined tomes, which is the Player's Tome, which had all the player-facing stuff in it, unsurprisingly enough. I'm now going to be having a quick flick through the Referees Tome. If you're not aware of what Old School Essentials is, originally it was a faithful sort of retro clone or sort of re-envisioning of the old Basic Expert D&D. You know, we just like the layout tweaked and a few sort of contradictions clarified, but it was largely faithful to the old game. Then this Advanced Fantasy Kickstarter adds in some additional options that are sort of AD&D and beyond stuff that's been retrofitted to work with the elegant simplicity of the sort of basic D&D style model. So let's have a quick flick through this PDF. But first of all, just let me remind you again that these are advanced pre-release PDFs that Gavin Norman of Necrotic Gnome was good enough to send out to the Kickstarter backers. Thanks to that, Gavin. And there may be changes made before they go into publication, and once the Kickstarter stuff has been sent out, I'm sure these will be available from Necrotic Gnome and Exalted Funeral. So let's look at the table of contents. First of all, we've got an introduction. We then have a section on running adventures, monsters, encounter tables, NPC encounters, treasure, magic items, sentient swords, great part of basic D&D that, and finally an index of tables, monsters and magic items. So the introduction, again, like the Player's Guide, gives us a bit of a breakdown on what Old School Essentials Advanced Fantasy is. To put it in the tome's own words, streamlined core rules founded in the tradition of the 1980s Basic Expert set, with some extra monsters and magic items inspired by the flavour of the 1970s Advanced First Edition rules. In order to use this book, you require the Advanced Fantasy Player's Tome, which I talked about in the last episode, so you can check that out if you want more of a sort of flick through of that. The first chapter after the introduction deals with running adventures. It talks about the referee's role, and it describes the referee as being a facilitator of fun and adventure, a neutral judge, and an arbiter of the rules. And there's a bit of a breakdown of what that means. And I think it's great to see the tome sort of wearing its heart on its sleeve and just putting that out there. And that seems to fit very well with the sort of BX style of giving procedures and clear advice that sort of in black and white puts down, you know, what you should be doing in a game and what the sort of role of a GM is, rather than sort of dancing around the subject. We get a small section on handling PCs, so it talks about how quickly you advance your group, whether you prefer a standard rate of advancement, you know, sort of 3-4 sessions to make it up to level 2, whether you want it slightly faster for your games or slightly slower, and the effects that they can have on your game. Talks about the distinction between player character and character knowledge, which is always an important distinction to bear in mind, and ways of maintaining the challenge and the pressure during your game. We then move on to running the game, where it gives some advice about how you describe things, sort of areas, unknown threats. There's a little bit of advice on using miniatures if that's your bag. And then we get a breakdown of monsters and NPCs, of how their intelligence can flavour the tactics they use in games. So, for example, does a monster use traps? Does it lay traps? Does it take advantage of them? Do they use guards or pets? If they've got magic items in their treasure hoard, if they're intelligent, do they pick up that singing sword out of their treasure hoard and use it when those threatening adventurers come in? I mean, why wouldn't they if they're intelligent? We then get a section on teamwork and how you can motivate sort of monsters and NPCs and whether they'll work with others to help combat the player characters. The next section, and this follows the same sort of style as the previous tomes and previous old school Essentials releases, of having these nice clearly laid out double page spreads where pretty much everything you need for a particular subject is on a single double page spread, which is well handy when you've got the book open in front of you. You're not having to flick backwards and forwards all the time, or at least that's kept to a minimum. The 2-page spread on adventure scenarios talks about how you can design an adventure, and it offers 10 different suggestions as for the sorts of adventures that are typical of your standard D&D setting. And these are banishing an ancient evil, clearing ruins, contacting a lost civilization, escaping from captivity, exploring unknown territory, performing a quest, rescuing captives, scouting an enemy outpost, seeking a magical doorway, or visiting a sacred site. And there's a little paragraph sort of elaborating on that for each of them. On page 10 and 11, we then get the first double page art spread in this tome, and it shows a hooded figure on a throne with undead guards to either side and what look to be teams of Durgar or deep dwarves of some kind erecting a golden statue. A beautiful piece of artwork, very evocative. We then move on to a double page spread about designing a dungeon. So it talks about choosing the setting for your dungeon and offers some typical examples, so like crypts, natural caverns, settlements, etc. We get some advice on choosing monsters, mapping the dungeons and stocking them. There's some example room traps, treasure traps, some example sort of special sort of environmental hazards like illusions, animated objects, and a sort of typical types of treasure that you might like to give at certain levels of your dungeon. And there are a couple of random tables to aid with that if you need those. We get a section on designing a wilderness. Again, it follows a similar format to designing a dungeon. You choose the setting, you map the region. In this, you locate human realms and non-human realms, put in a base town for the players to range out from, scatter your dungeons around, and create a regional set of encounter tables. We get some guidelines on designing a base town, typical inhabitants for the sort of pseudo-medieval setting of D&D for villages, small towns, large towns and cities. Note the services that are available in the towns. You have black markets, healings, lodgings, rumours, all that sort of good stuff that adventurers need to get themselves going. Detail the ruler and how the settlement is ruled. Detail any other NPCs in the setting, and of course create those all-important local rumours that are going to send your player characters off on a lifetime of adventure. We then get a short 1-page section about awarding XP, whether you want to award that for just recovering treasure or also for defeating monsters. There are various options and scales available for that, and a little bit of discussion about how the XP should be divided. We then move on to the monsters section, the bestiary effectively. We get a description of the game statistics are going to feature in that and how that breaks down in a nice double page spread, along with some generally useful notes on improvision, languages, and whether a monster is classified as a person or not, when the players bust out that whole person spell. We get combat tables listing the attack rolls to hit and the THAC0 for the various different creatures, and also their saving throws. And then we go straight into the actual monster descriptions themselves. And I'm not going to go into all the different monsters here, but there's a wide range of different things, ranging from white apes to bears to black puddings, blink dogs, cave locusts, dark creepers, djinn, dragons, of course, it's Dungeons and Dragons, dwarves, giant ferrets, giant fish, flail snails, ghasts, giants, gnolls, all of that sort of good stuff you can find in the bestiary. And the monster stats are kept pretty brief. You tend to get 1 or 2 lines of description, then you get a little condensed stat block, and then normally sort of 3 or 4 little bullet points that sum up any particular special abilities or sort of little skills or little tricks that that monster might have, or sort of certain methods of behavior. So for instance, to look at one of the example monsters, the Merrow, we are told that they are frightful humanoids, 9 foot tall with green scales, shaggy weed-like hair and webbed hands and feet, sometimes called aquatic ogres. They dwell in shallow waters, lairing in underground caves. We get the little stat block for them. Then we're told that they have a 4 in 6 chance of surprising people due to camouflage, and they can only breathe out of water for 2 hours. So that's the sort of a level of sort of stats we're looking at. Some creatures have a few more tricks and abilities, some have less, but it's nicely condensed. You're not going to have to read through an entire page of stats and ridiculous abilities to use any of these monsters. And old favourites like the Lich and various things like that, yeah, I know, I love me a Lich, are all in there. There's also another beautiful double page artwork spread on page 116 and 117, which appears to show a sort of halfling, I presume, wizard and other adventurer walking through the woods, and there's this twisted, sort of gnarled, almost demonic looking tree with a jagged mouth and fiery red eyes sort of looming out into the path behind them. Great stuff. We then get a set of encounter tables for both dungeons and the wilderness. The dungeon one is divided by level, so you get 2 tables in here, one for levels 1 to 3 and one for levels 4+. The wilderness tables are fairly extensive. You roll a d8 and then you read along the top of the table to the terrain type that your player party is in. Once you've found the result, it gives you a sub-table to roll on related to that particular type of terrain. You then roll a d20 on that, and it tells you what sort of creature has been encountered. We then get a section on NPC encounters, which gives you a procedure for generating parties of NPC adventurers. The book advises you that this procedure is fairly involved, so you might like to generate some NPC parties for use in random encounters. And if I remember correctly, I can't check at the moment, but if I remember correctly, I believe that this is potentially going to be added to the online generators that are on the Old School Essentials website, which would be a great thing to see. And effectively, you can just follow this procedure, making a number of choices or random rolls to gen up a party of NPC adventurers for your players to bump into. We then get a page on strongholds, but this is talking about players not really building their own strongholds. That's in the sort of player's tome, but this is when they come across a stronghold owned by an NPC, and there's details on determining what sort of ruler is in charge of that stronghold, how far and wide they send their men to patrol, what sort of garrison they have there, and what sort of reaction they're likely to have. And there's a little table to determine that if you want. Do they try and chase the PCs out of their territory, ignore them, or are they maybe friendly and invite them in for some sort of parley? We then move on to a section called Treasures, which gives some advice about placing treasure, whether that's rolling randomly or via referee's choice. And there are a number of tables which detail various types of monster treasure hoards that you can find. These are all distinguished by the letters of the alphabet. You get told sort of roughly on average how much each type of hoard will yield. And then you get a sort of table which lists a percentage chance of finding a certain amount of money. So, for example, if you come across a monster that has a Type A treasure hoard, we're told that the average is 18,000 gold pieces. Amongst the Type A treasure hoard, there is a 25% chance of there being 1d6 times 1,000 copper pieces, a 30% chance of there being 1d6 times 1,000 silver pieces, a 20% chance of there being 1d4 times 1,000 electrum pieces, a 35% chance of there being 2d6 times 1,000 gold pieces, a 25% chance of there being 1d2 times 1,000 platinum pieces, a 50% chance of there being 6d6 gems, a 50% chance of there being 6d6 pieces of jewellery, and a 30% chance of there being 3 magic items. And the letter codes A to O correspond to hordes. The letter codes P to T correspond to individual treasures, and the letter codes U and V correspond to group treasures. We then get some details on magical items along with random tables to determine what sort of magical items you'll get if you're rolling them for a horde. There's some advice on identifying them, how they can be used, whether the magic item requires a command word, and if so, how can the players work it out, as well as some quite useful advice on how to handle players who manage to get their hands on items that bestow wishes. Now, these have the potential to be quite game-changing, so it's nice to see some strong advice in the book. We get some details on gems and jewellery and a table for rolling to determine the value of gems and various pieces of jewellery. And then we go into the list of magic items. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because there's a lot of them. But they range from your fairly typical like armour that gives you like bonuses to AC, weapons that give you bonuses to attack and damage and stuff like that, to more sort of esoteric, like miscellaneous items like cubes of force, displacer close, Ifriti bottles, gems of seeing, and all of the many and various magic items that D&D players will be familiar with. And each of those gets a write-up, again with a few sentences describing what they do and some clear bullet points sort of telling you like how long they last, if there's any secondary effects, that sort of thing. It's all nice and clearly laid out for you. On page 194 and 195 we get another beautiful 2-page artwork spread which appears to show a sort of ethereal or semi-invisible hero carrying probably a coin purse or maybe even a potion bottle, sort of slinking past some guards. Again, very atmospheric, great to see this, which segues neatly into the potions section. You get a random table telling you how you can determine what sort of potions are found in a horde. We're told how they can be used, how they can be identified, what happens if you mix potions, etc. And what happens if you just try and like sample a little bit of a potion, which tends to be my default sort of method of determining what a potion does if I'm playing D&D or Old School Essentials, to be honest. So it's nice to actually see some sort of clear rules for that. Obviously GMs can change it for their own game, but it's nice to see it down in the actual book. We get a section on magical rings, rods, staves and wands, scrolls and maps. Now, one of the things that I like about this is that obviously we know what scrolls do. They have spells on that can be used. There's curse scrolls which cause harmful effects. There's protection scrolls which when they're activated it conjures a 10-foot radius of protection around you that protects you against a certain type of creature. But I do love seeing the treasure maps on there, and the treasure maps are ranked by number from 1 to 12, and a little section in here tells you basically the number code corresponds to what the treasure map leads to. So a class 1 treasure map leads to 1 magic item, a class 5 treasure map leads to 3 magic items and a potion, and a class 12 treasure map leads to a horde worth 66 times 1,000 gold pieces. And that's really nice to see. Obviously the GM would have to elaborate on that a bit and prepare the sort of adventure site where you would find the horde or the magic items or whatever, but it's nice to see some rules that actually say, yeah, this is the classification of treasure map you rolled, this is the sort of thing it should be leading to. We get a section on swords, very important in a game that's based on BX D&D, a section on other magical weapons, and finally sentient swords, which I remember was quite a big thing back in the day. And basically, if you roll a sword that possesses sentience and a special purpose, it has what's called an ego rating, which it tells you how to determine in here. It's basically a measurement of their force of personality. The intelligence and ego of the sword determines how many additional powers it has, how it communicates with the wielder, but also if the ego's far higher than the player character who's wielding it, and the sword doesn't like what's going on, it may try and take control of the character and determine what they do to further its own goals. And all of this is dealt with in this section. And finally, after that, we have an index of tables in the book and an index of the various monsters that are in there, followed by an index of magic items, and then the open game license. And it's great to see these 3 indexes at the back of the tome, because obviously the tomes are fairly thick. I mean, this one's sort of 240 pages plus, so it's nice to have not only a really nice contents page, but also a comprehensive index page that you can quickly look things up and hopefully minimize the amount of time you spend flicking looking for stuff in the tome during your game. And I think the nice and clear layout and the 2-page spread that's become sort of synonymous with Necrotic Gnome publications also strengthens this and makes it very easy to find stuff during your game. So if you are interested in old school essentials and you maybe want to have like a few more of those optional rules and some more of that stuff that's inspired by AD&D first edition, I really recommend you pick up both of this and the Player's Guide tome. The books are also available, the Advanced Fantasy and the core books, in sort of thin individual volumes. But for me, you can't go far wrong with picking up these 2 tomes, and you've got everything you need to rock and roll and run your own old school essentials game. I'm currently running a campaign using the classic fantasy rules tomes with the PDFs of some of the advanced options, but I cannot wait to get my hands on the hard copies of these tomes, so I've got them all there and I can easily reference them during my games. So if you've backed the Kickstarter, you already know what I'm talking about, because you've got these advanced PDFs and you're probably waiting on tenterhooks like I am for the actual hard copies. If you have missed the Kickstarter, then what I would say is, after the Kickstarter's been fulfilled, these books will no doubt be available from Necrotic Gnome and Exalted Funeral, so check them out. If you love BX D&D and such like, you will not be disappointed. So that's it for this episode. If you want to get in touch with us, you can drop us a voicemail using SpeakPipe. There's a link in the description of this episode, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.